All right, let's talk about one of the most famous, or maybe infamous, military actions in all of history. The charge of the Light Brigade. Now, you've probably heard it's this epic story of incredible bravery, right? Immortalized in poetry and all that. But what if I told you that the whole celebrated legend is actually built on a foundation of, well, incompetence, bitter rivalry, and one absolutely catastrophic mistake? That's what we're digging into today.
Yeah, for most of us, this is how we know the story. These words, "Into the jaws of death rode the 600. So powerful. Alfred Lord Tennyson's ballad really painted this picture of noble sacrifice, pure, unwavering heroism. And honestly, it's that romantic version that has completely dominated the narrative for over 150 years now.
But, and this is a huge but, behind all that beautiful poetry lies a much uglier truth. That glorious venture, it was, in reality, a catastrophic military blunder. We're talking about a story that's not just about courage, it's about bitter feuds, baffling incompetence, and just a truly staggering loss of life.
Okay, so that's the big question, right? How on earth does a total disaster become a timeless legend? Well, it's almost entirely down to that poem. Tennyson's words immortalized the event. They shaped public perception so powerfully that the myth completely overshadowed the grim, bloody reality of what actually happened on that battlefield in Crimea.
So, that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to peel back those layers of myth, one by one. And to do it, we're not just going to look at history books. We're going to rely on the accounts of the cavalrymen themselves. I mean, the actual guys who charged into what they called the mouth of hell, and somehow lived to tell the tale. Now, to really get how a disaster of this scale could even happen, you have to start at the top. We've got to look at the men in charge. Because believe me, the tragedy of the Light Brigade, it began long before the first shot was ever fired. It started with a command structure that was just fundamentally completely broken. So who was leading this legendary brigade? Who was at the helm? Well, as it turns out, the answer reveals a personal rivalry so toxic it practically guaranteed something was going to go terribly wrong.
Okay, so check this out. You've got two key commanders. The entire cavalry division, that's led by the Earl of Lucan, and the Light Brigade itself, that's under the command of the Earl of Cardigan. Now here's the fatal twist, the real kicker. These two men didn't just despise each other, they were brothers-in-law. And their feud was infamous, legendary. They literally refused to speak to one another, communicating only through their junior officers. This open contempt created an unbelievably toxic environment right at the very top. It was a recipe for disaster.
So you've got this powder keg of toxic leadership just waiting to explode. And that's the backdrop for the critical moment of the charge. Because right in the middle of the chaos of battle, a single, fatally ambiguous order is about to be given. An order that would set in motion a chain of events sending hundreds of men straight to their doom.
And this is where that classic military concept, the fog of war, becomes absolutely crucial. Just try to imagine a chaotic battlefield. There's smoke everywhere, the noise is deafening, and you've only got bits and pieces of information. In that situation, clear communication isn't just important, it's everything. And on that day, October 25th, 1854, that communication didn't just fail, it completely, utterly broke down.
So let's trace exactly how this went so wrong. It's like a tragic chain reaction. First, a really vague order is issued from high command. Something about attacking some Russian guns. Okay, vague, but maybe workable. But then, that order is relayed verbally down the chain. And here's the critical error. Because of where the commanders were standing, their vantage point, they completely misinterpreted which guns they were supposed to attack. So, instead of going after a vulnerable target, they aimed the Light Brigade at a heavily fortified Russian battery at the far end of a long valley. A valley lined with cannons on 3 sides. A death trap.
And just like that, the fatal order was given. The Light Brigade began its advance, and Tennyson's poetic Valley of Death, well, it was about to become a terrifyingly real place.
The poem famously says 600, but the actual number of men who trotted forward that day was 666. And these weren't just any soldiers. They were from 5 of Britain's most elite light cavalry regiments, charging directly into the line of fire. Just picture this. The tactical situation was an absolute nightmare. As they galloped down this long valley, they weren't just being fired on from the cannons waiting at the end. No, they were caught in what's called an enfilade, a deadly crossfire. They had Russian cannons and riflemen on the high ground to their left and on the high ground to their right. They were trapped.
And the cost, it was just staggering. And it all happened in a matter of minutes. Think about that. Out of those 666 men, 110 were killed outright, 129 were wounded, another 32 were taken prisoner. That's 271 casualties. We're talking about over 40% of the entire force wiped out in the time it takes to make a cup of coffee.
And you know, the devastation wasn't just limited to the men. Let's not forget the horses. Over 500 horses were either killed during the charge itself or had to be put down afterward because their injuries were so severe. It was just utter carnage.
It's almost impossible for us to imagine what that must have been like. But we do have the words of the survivors. Listen to this from Captain Robert Portal of the 4th Light Dragoons. He wrote that shells fell like hail all around us, which whistled through our ranks, dealing death and destruction.
So after all that death and destruction, you have to ask, what did the charge actually accomplish? Was it really a moment of sublime, unforgettable courage, or was it just a tragic, senseless slaughter? Believe it or not, that debate is still raging today.
Essentially, there are two ways to look at this. On one side, you have the view that it was, plain and simple, an unnecessary bungle, an act of madness that crippled the British cavalry for the rest of the war. But then, there's another viewpoint. Some historians argue that if you judge the charge by what they thought their objective was, taking those guns at the end of the valley, then it was, and this is a quote, an astounding success. Why? Because against all odds, the survivors actually made it there and took the guns.
So in the end, there's just no simple answer here. And that's kind of fitting, isn't it? Just like the original orders were shrouded in fog and confusion, the legacy of the charge itself is still deeply contentious. It was, at the exact same time, a complete military disaster and an absolutely incredible feat of human bravery.
And so that's what we're left with. We rightly remember the unbelievable bravery of the men who charged into that valley. No one can take that away from them. But we also have to remember that their heroism was forged in the fire of a catastrophic error. And it forces us to ask a really tough question. When history is written by mistake, who truly owns the glory? Thanks for joining The Explainer.